Excellencies, members, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Press Club and to our guest today, the Treasurer, Mr Keating. I'm not going to attempt to introduce the man who's managed to virtually balance the budget and at the same time make it more expansionary than last year. Apart from that, he's got almost no time, only about 45 minutes before he has to be back in the House. So the floor is yours right now, Mr Keating.
Thank you, Madam President. Sorry. Oh, this one works, does it?
Yep.
Right. Guy, thank you once again for this very kind invitation to address the National Press Club and ladies and gentlemen. Well, this is the fifth post-budget speech I've had the pleasure of delivering at this forum. And this occasion follows one of the Hawke government's, I think, most outstanding achievements. In 5 budgets, we've restored the Commonwealth budget from being almost $10,000 million in deficit in 1983 to balance for the year ahead. Impressive though this turnaround is, it is the quality of the underlying policy decisions which validates this budget's place in the history books. Today I'd like to deal with some elements of our fiscal package which were not canvassed in last night's budget address. Speaking here following the 1987 May statement, I reflected upon the sheer quality of information which is made available in the Commonwealth's budget papers. I said at the time that the detail and comprehensiveness of our documentation was second to none in the world. Well, those of you who had the benefit of examining the 87-8 budget papers would, I'm sure, endorse that conclusion. The volume and precision of detail concerning outlays, the Commonwealth's revenue base, the forecasts and assumptions, and the exposition of our external adjustment strategy inform the nation of every salient feature of the Commonwealth's finances and policy strategy in general. This year, the addition of the innovative analysis of Budget Statement Number 7, which draws the distinction between the general government sector and public trading enterprises, further reinforces our commitment to opening the operations of government to the most rigorous scrutiny. Following last year's budget, a number of commentators were moved to criticise various of the assumptions, forecasts and other details contained in the budget. The fact that very few of our critics' more dire predictions, very few of them in fact came true, which has undoubtedly caused them to be less cavalier this time round. In fact, I think I'm pleased to observe that most informed early commentary appears to endorse the broad thrust of our economic strategy, particularly our emphasis on lifting the tradable sector's performance. Central to this strategy, and hence to a satisfactory pace of external adjustment, is a lift in private investment in the areas where it counts. In 1986-87, the principal influences which operated to subdue investment were slower growth, higher real interest rates and more intensive utilisation of the capital stock flowing from the fall in the price of labour relative to capital. There were also signs that business confidence in our capacity to stay competitive increased as 1986-87 proceeded. Such confidence is now consolidating. Accordingly, for the year ahead, we expect a stronger overall business investment performance to key off positive changes in the balance of those influences I've just referred to. However, in considering Australia's past and future investment performance, it is essential to go beyond simple aggregate numbers to draw meaningful conclusions. Our preeminent requirement is to lift the flow of resources to the tradable sector. As identified in Budget Statement Number 2, this shift is already occurring. Further confirmation is provided by a metal trades industry survey released last Sunday, which indicates an increase in investment in plant and equipment of 22.5% this year, following an increase of 16% in 1986-87. Allowing for price increases, those are very strong real increases. Second, with investment by firms in motor vehicles comprising about a quarter of total private investment, a downturn in registrations can have a profound effect, masking the underlying investment trends. Recent Treasury estimates indicate that the fall in vehicle registrations between 1984-5 and 1986-7 was alone sufficient to account for the apparent sluggish performance of business investment over that period. This work suggests two things. The non-vehicle component of total business investment has increased by over 10% in the 3 years to 1986-7, and second, that the non-vehicle component of equipment investment has risen over this period compared with a fall when vehicles are included. Our forecast for the year ahead incorporates 7% real growth in non-vehicle equipment investment and 4% for business investment as a whole. This compares with forecast growth of 0.4% and 3% for the major OECD industries in calendar years 87 and 88 respectively. Continuing the focus on external policy, we are forecasting a further strong net export performance for the year ahead. Although down from last year's 2.3%, 1987-88 will be the third successive year of positive net export contribution to growth. This is a performance not equalled since the early 1970s. The net export contribution of 1 percentage point is expected to be well above the long-run average of the past 25 years of virtually nil contribution to GDP and 0.3% average rate for the last 10 years. Whilst private demand will rise this year, with business investment the fastest growing component, there will be a counterweight of negative public demand coming from the budget and the Premier's conference in May. Combining the predicted composition of economic growth with an expectation of a small rise in our terms of trade in 1987-88, we are confident of further tangible progress in overcoming our current account problem. Last year saw considerable evidence of the necessary diversification of our export base, with half of our export growth coming from manufactured exports. With the tourism industry emerging as a rapidly growing foreign exchange earner, we've wound back the tourism deficit by $400 million in 1986-87, and we forecast it will continue to assist the current account adjustment. However, even with a further fall in our trade deficit to 4% of GDP, as we forecast in the coming year, our net external debt will not stabilise for some time before it falls. Accordingly, the requirements of budgetary and wage restraint are ongoing and must remain so until our international debt position subsides. Those prescriptions are not new. The government has been openly and honestly explaining the challenges that we face since the prices of our exports collapsed in 1985-86. The fact that the public came to terms with this reality and rejected sugar-coated opposition bribes contributed more than Conservative disunity or any Joe factor or anything else to our renewed electoral mandate. The failure of the opposition parties rests squarely with their incapacity to grapple with the new economic and political order. One would think the election results would have taught them something, yet they show no signs of recanting their cargo cult appeals. At his press conference on the 12th of July, Mr Howard again asserted that his election policies were right. In other words, he confirmed his objective to make a deficit cut which would scarcely touch the sides, a mere $270 million on his own figuring. So Mr Howard is apparently content with a budget deficit billions of dollars larger than we have in fact achieved. A Howard government would not be retiring overseas debt this year. It would not be simultaneously redeeming overseas and domestic bonds for the first time in 50 years. It would still have its hands in the pockets of Australians for their savings, and would be dramatically heating up rather than easing pressure on interest rates. In short, fiscal vandalism of this breathtaking dimension would wreck the adjustment process carefully nurtured by this government. Our painstaking work in restoring integrity to the tax system and carefully combing through Commonwealth outlays would have been cast asunder. Today, the task for the public sector is to deliver well-targeted services efficiently and to ensure that those best able to pay for our economic and social infrastructure do so. It means diminishing the public sector's demand for savings so that they can be directed towards private investment where we require it in the tradables area of the economy. To this end, the Commonwealth is clearly pulling its weight. Our achievement in this budget means that the Commonwealth Government sector will be making a zero net contribution to the borrowing requirements of the public sector in the year ahead. The gross PSBR is expected to sit at around 2.2% of GDP in 1987-88, almost a quarter of what it was in 1983-84. It should be noted, however, that between 1983-84 and 86 and 87, the Commonwealth has exclusively carried the full extent of the shift down in net public sector borrowing. This demonstrates the magnitude of the task we've undertaken in redressing the legacies of Messrs Fraser and Howard, who incited the states in the early 1980s to massively overborrow for their capital programs. Between 1980-81 and 82-3, the state's net borrowings rose by nearly a full percentage point of GDP. It has taken 5 years of effort by the Commonwealth to rein in that borrowing surge. Together with the fact that outlays, receipts and the deficit of the Commonwealth will all fall in relation to GDP this year, there should remain no doubts as to the magnitude of the fiscal shift achieved in Australia. Our budgetary stance is as tight as a drum. Madam President, not only are the policy changes ushered in by this government bringing permanent economic effects, but they've fundamentally altered the political agenda for the rest of this century. The measures we have adopted to open Australia up to the competitive signals from the world, from the float to the two-tier wage system to the massive fiscal adjustments, we are producing in a new and permanent discipline over government. A less recognised consequence of these changes is that the pressures on the government can currently apply with equal force to oppositions as well. It is this point which Mr Howard, at his peril, has failed to comprehend during the 2 years in which he has led the Liberal Party. In the previous Parliament, Mr Howard's continuously evasive responses to questions regarding the government's revenue-based broadening measures and his ambivalence about our spending cuts employs tactics typical of Conservative leaders in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, but such standards will not suffice today. All through 1986, Mr Howard was ducking and weaving reasonable questions as to his attitude to the taxation of capital gains, fringe benefits and the deductibility of entertainment expenses. Earlier this year, following the May statement, a number of you attempted to elicit from him his views about the income testing of family allowances. On not one occasion was a straight answer obtained. It may be a feature of the new Parliament that Mr Howard continues to flip-flop on every hard issue the way he has done in the past 2 years. Where does he stand now on the revenue measures which enable us to recoup an extra billion and help reduce the deficit in 86-87? What does he say about those same measures which are contributing to a balanced budget in 1987-88? Does he now support the savings measures outlined in the May statement and in this budget? And does he still believe the deficit for 87-88 should have been cut by a mere $270 million rather than $2,700 million, which we have achieved? Madam Chairman, as I said in my address last night, the foundations of this budget are twofold: a better targeting of government spending, together with repairs and reforms to the tax system. It is a budget which not only continues the impetus to the massive transformation which has taken place in Australia, but stands as a monument to the competence and compassion of this government. It is a budget which I, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, and all members of the government take great pride. Thank you very much for the opportunity of speaking, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Mr Treasurer. I've got a long list of questions and a short time in which to do something about all of them. Before I call on media members to ask their questions, I'll remind them to state their name and that of their organisation, and the first question is from Nikki Sava.
Nikki Sava from the Melbourne Sun, Mr Keating. At what stage would the government be prepared to look at reducing personal income tax scales, given your commitment yesterday to reducing and reviewing company tax?
Well, I don't think that commitment is a commitment to a discrete review of the company tax system, and it doesn't imply reductions in the rates in the personal tax system. Though I observe here, as I did in the election campaign, it may be possible in the course of this Parliament to provide income tax relief. But that is a measure that's a matter for the government to consider in the face of fiscal policy as it unfolds in the context of the economy over the course of the Parliament. But the review of the business tax system is a discrete review of that system, and at this stage that is the government's intention.
Jeff Zorby.
Jeff Zorby, the National Interest Treasurer. I noted that we now have a child support agency. How are you going to pursue maintenance defaulters? How much do you expect to get from this? Are you going to garnish wages? And lastly, have you considered that maintenance payments could well be tax deductible?
Well, Jeff, I think this has all been laid out in press statements by my colleague, Brian Howe, who is principally responsible for the system. The Tax Office will administer the system, and we expect to have that system operating from memory in the early part of 1988. But I'd have to refresh my memory on the detail.
Dennis Atkins.
Dennis Atkins from the Melbourne Sun, Mr. Keating. Last night the government announced that there was going to be an assets task force established within the Department of Finance. Could you give us something of the agenda that task force will be working to, and will it only look at the sale of assets, or would it also look at the sale of enterprises?
Well, we didn't establish that last night. That was established after May. It's been operating since May within the Department of Finance, and it is basically developing a pool of experience and capacity to dispose of Commonwealth assets. Now, we have, other than in a minor way, only routinely disposed of Commonwealth assets. But if one exposes of Commonwealth assets which have an operating quality to them, for instance, as the Williamstown Dockyard has, and before we made the decision to remove the international airport terminals from the program, also considering the sale of such an enterprise as that, we were seeking to develop within that task force some capacity to develop a disposal system which created the best opportunity for the Commonwealth to maximise its returns, at the same time make an arrangement which satisfied all the public policy interests. Now that task force is carrying on, and as we indicate in this budget, there will be at least a 1,000 million contribution to outlays from the assets which we have already indicated to you from May, and next year a further 1,000 million from the sale of the Defence Service Homes loan portfolio, other defence equipment and assets, and property. Now, within the next 2 years or year or so, no doubt this group will develop skills in this area which we don't presently have, or at least hone those skills, and that obviously will be a base of a particular skill as it relates to the market, which we don't, I think, presently have. And of course that could be applied to whatever the government sought to apply it to.
Matthew Abraham.
Matthew Abraham from the Adelaide Advertiser, Mr. Keating. Does your budget result not prove that the government is able to counter tax evasion by conventional means, given the appropriate staff resources, without the need for an ID card? And on another level, when can we see the art gallery tapes, or hear them at least?
Oh. Are you a budding neoclassicist too, are you? God, we've got a cultural revolution on here. I noticed a picture of Mare in a David picture last night up in the Melbourne Herald Gallery, so it's really coming on with a vengeance. Well, let me say about the ID card. No, the implication of your question is essentially wrong, and that is that the fact that we have broadened the tax base and are now reaping such a harvest from what was otherwise either non-declared income or income expressly sheltered from the tax system indicates purely that that was an area where tax reform was necessary. But none of us would pretend that those changes are changes which would give us the revenue which would come from the operating efficiencies of a simple, sole, common Commonwealth number, which is what the ID card is about. That is allowing computer technology to work efficiently around a single number. And such things as rental income, undeclared interest income, social security fraud, all of those things we are not pretending that the FBT or capital gains can in any way chase some of that revenue down. So our forecast has always been for about an additional $1 billion to the revenue from the ID card, and what is clear in the tax statistics of the last budget and the first couple of months of this financial year is there's been about an extra $1 billion there from these areas where we expressly broadened the tax base. Now, I might just ask you to remember that when we had option C on the table, the new money, if you like, that was to the fiscal dividend from the consumption tax was $1.5 billion. So to pick up something of that order from the base broadening measures and something again of comparable order from the ID card is something very worthwhile indeed. And given the fact that you saw last night one of the most, I think, significant social reforms in the family allowance supplement for low-income families, costing in a full year $500 million of effective targeted assistance, $1 billion goes a long way, whether it be applied to producing budget surpluses or wiping out deficits or meeting other social objectives. And so therefore the implication does not follow that because we've got this money that we should not seek to secure other funds from the system that are being evaded, that are not being brought to tax by virtue of the fact that there is no common number between the various elements of the system, be it employment, albeit social security, albeit bank accounts, albeit taxation or whatever. And so that's why the ID card is important. It's a structural tool and it ought to be there. And of course, I have the same contempt as the Prime Minister has for those who have sought to try and dredge up a phony case about it being an internal passport, A lot of the people who say that just want to get themselves on television and, sort of assorted nymphomaniacs for publicity. But anyway, let me deal with the final thing about the art gallery. We'll give you a transcript when we clean one up.
Michelle Grattan.
Michelle Grattan from The Age. Mr Keating, on your review of business taxation, you made a lot during the election campaign of the dangers of having a different top personal tax rate and company rate. Could you elaborate further on how you could bring the company rate down without dropping the personal rate, and what sort of safeguards you would build in if you decided to do that?
Well, Michelle, you were putting a question to me. You did put to me in another form yesterday. Perhaps I could just say in answer that in most countries the top personal tax rate is above the company tax rate. That was the case in this country for many, many years. The fact that the personal tax rate was so high in this country at 60% under our predecessors, and the company rate was at 46%, meant there was a very substantial opportunity to diminish income by incorporating, and a lot of that was undertaken. Now, the propensity to diminish income will always be there while there is some disparity, a greater propensity with a greater disparity, less with less. So that asymmetry between the top marginal tax rate and the company rate, while as it stands, diminishes much of that phony incorporation and trusts and the rest, does not necessarily imply that were it to widen somewhat, that we would see a return to that sort of activity. But they're judgments we would have to make. But of course, there are still people who do not have the opportunity of incorporation, or who may not seek to incorporate, but who are subject to the top marginal rate anyway. It only applies to a certain body of taxpayers. It can only be available to a certain class of taxpayers anyway. So, as I said earlier, this is a review of the company tax rate, and the implications for the personal rates will have to remain until we look further. But let me just make one final point about the 49 rate. And there were people, particularly in the Labor Party, who took the view that we should never remove the 60% rate from the system. And they said that going to 49 meant that we were diminishing the equity of the tax system. And we made the point that high marginal rates over a narrow income range effectively meant very few people were paying that 60% rate, and that many of the people who appeared in the income tax statistics with nominally low incomes were in fact incomes diminished by deductions, and they were not in fact nominally low at all. But the very harvest we are now reaping from the base broadening measures is coming almost exclusively from those categories of income earners. And in other words, the equity is now obvious and apparent that it's coming from FBT, capital gains, substantiation, abolition of entertainment, that is the categories of higher income earners who were formerly not declaring that income or avoiding taxation on that income. But we've said, which is no different than many other countries have said to all taxpayers, look, you can have a choice here. You can have general average lower rates or lower marginal rates of tax for all taxpayers to take out deductions which have been overworked by some taxpayers. And we took that reduction for all taxpayers by cleaning the base up. Now, the equity in it all is, I think, now entirely apparent. And our detractors at the time, while muted these days, might reflect upon the fact that all these things were said then.
Jeff Kidney.
Jeff Kidney, Times on Sunday, Mr Keating. You've just completed another exhausting round of Expenditure Review Committee meetings, which Senator Button the other day was moved to describe as a ridiculous process without much of a future, and suggested that the time had come to look at some different way of achieving budgetary restraint, possibly by program budgeting. Does the ERC have a future, or has the time come for a different approach?
Well, the first point I make is that some of the longer-serving members of it think we alone are qualified to make commentary about the future of the ERC. The second point I'd make is that the ERC has brought to Commonwealth outlays a set of disciplines and priorities which have been pretty much constant since 1983. And I think in the hard tack of cutting outlays, which political systems of this variety find very difficult to do, we have developed a very effective mechanism here. One of the things that happens in a resource clearing exercise like this is once it becomes effective that the operating departments tend to use it to have the political decisions made to clear those resources and allocate them. That tends to become a bit silly in some respects because you end up with consideration of minor matters which should never come near us. Now, I think that can be attended to without diminishing the corporate role of the ERC process. I think that can be diminished by, if you like, lifting the finance function in those minor areas. But to diminish the corporate view, if you like, of the ERC ministers, is to depreciate a very valuable instrument which this government's developed. And of course, if one were to break it up, you break up the thought process of the ambience of the whole thing, the comprehension of it all. So while I would not say that we would continue to maintain the ERC exclusively in the form it's in now, I would say that as a mechanism, as an effective review area for Commonwealth outlays which must be changed with political decision, and where the political priorities are being brought to bear, then I think the ERC has been a very effective thing, and for Australia at this time, given this government a chance to resort priorities, but with consistency.
Mike Steketee.
Mike Steketee, Sydney Morning Herald. Would you agree that the tax concessions for superannuation are the remaining major fault in what you call the integrity of the tax system that you've built up? And what priority will you give in your review of company tax to reviewing those concessions?
Well, I think we'll probably review that along with the company tax system.
Matthew Frost.
Matthew Frost, SBS TV. You say that you're expecting strong export performance in the year ahead. Which exports will improve, and does this include any primary exports?
Well, what we're saying is we still expect to see strong export numbers like we did last year, somewhat diminished on last year because in some of the areas, obviously in the rural areas, rural commodities, we're not doing as well as we were. Others have been improved, and last year, of course, there are a number of one-offs in there. Disposal of the Commonwealth uranium stockpile was one that comes to mind. Export of aircraft was another. Abstracting for those, we've got, I think, very credible numbers there, and today's balance of payments figure again shows very strong exports. Exports are running very strongly, well, and so the number, I think, is entirely safe, entirely conservative.
Louise Dodson.
Louise Dodson, Financial Review, Mr. Keating. On the company tax review again, will any changes you make be revenue neutral? That is, any reductions be fully financed by base broadening measures?
They're principles which, in the broad, yes, but it's just being specific about it, no, because I'm not in a position to make those sorts of judgments about it at this stage. I mean, that's the intention. We're not about trying to subsidise a thing down from out of the personal income tax system, for instance.
Ian Cassie.
Ian Cassie, Financial Review. Mr. Keating, you referred to the gross PSBR reduction, but the primary drain on domestic savings comes from the net PSBR. I wonder, given the behaviour of the states so far, if you've got any forecasts for what the net PSBR will do in 87-88.
We think it'll be around about, it's only a forecast, but we think it'll be around about 2.5% of GDP. That is about 0.4 for the Commonwealth sector and about 2.2 for the states. Now that may be wrong, but it implies judgments about the rate of decline of cash balances, but which have been diminished by the reductions in the gross PSBR coming from the Loan Council and the global ceilings. So we're starting to see there, if you see in Statement 7 of the budget papers, there's a graph in Statement 7 which has the gross and the net differential closing, so that the two will become one at some point or cross over, but we don't continue the line because one then has to make just simply a judgment about the way and resort to the cash balances. But a fair estimation of what we think is available and what the states are likely to do means that we have affected at least about 1.2 percentage points reduction in the net PSBR. Now, many commentators said we would not achieve anything like that, and of course they were not right.
Kerry O'Brien.
Mr. Keating, do you now see any need for a mini budget next year? Do you agree with Senator Walsh's comments of a few weeks ago that you'll still be facing tough options next year on the big ticket sacred cow items like pensions, welfare, other welfare payouts, health, etc.? In that context, how important is it that the Labor Party bites the bullet on privatisation? And after your experience at the tax summit, will you be happy to have the Prime Minister continue to make the running on that issue?
You always ask such nice and easy questions. But Well, let me just tell you about next year's budget. The outlay savings in this year's budget will be exceeded next year off these decisions without any further shift in policy. On a no-change policy basis, the outlay savings next year are greater than this year. So they're ongoing. There's a structural change in there. And much of what my colleague Senator Walsh was referring to is in fact being dealt with and has been dealt with over the years by the government. Now, that is not to say that there isn't areas where we have higher rates of growth in some programs than others, but we've always had to find offsetting changes in the outlays, which broadly we have found. So that if you look at the prospects for next year, if you like, for the budget, we'll have, we think, a better starting point from the outlays, and while some of our revenue will be diminished by such things as Reserve Bank profit, that on balance we will do as well from the outlays as we will do from seeing some of those other things diminish. So the starting point view from this position for next year looks pretty good. As far as privatisation is concerned, the trouble with the very term implies that there is some sort of, ideological view. We've got to get in there and move these things off because we don't like them. But I think what the government has been intent upon doing is routinely reviewing assets to see whether in fact we think we should hold them, whether they could be more efficiently used outside, whether they would diminish subventions from the budget if taken off the budget, whether they would be more efficient to the general economy moved off the budget. And I think we will continue to make those reviews, and to the extent that we are constrained in making those reviews comprehensively by the current policy of the party, well, as the Prime Minister said so often, that's a matter we will address in terms of the next national conference to try and loosen up that capacity for the government to review those things. But this budget is in balance, and the asset sales program of this year is to be replicated next year. So we are not relying upon a decision of the National Conference of the Labor Party one way or the other to maintain balance in the budgets or to even move them further into surplus.
Steve Burrell.
Steve Burrell from the Sydney Morning Herald, Mr. Keating. About 3 weeks ago at a press conference you said, and I quote, "On our current figuring we couldn't get near a balanced budget." You also said it simply wasn't feasible. More importantly, you argued during the campaign and after that such a radical restraint of government spending and fiscal outcome would be inappropriate in the economic circumstances we face. When did you realise you could reach a balanced budget? When did you decide it was a good idea economically? And how long do you think you can get away with pulling rabbits out of the hat for the money market?
Well, we don't always try and pull rabbits out of the hat. They just fall out of the hat. And, but the thing is, what I said to you at the time, I meant we did have a lift in the base of about $1 billion coming off the 1986-7 budget. You may remember my announcement in the last couple of weeks of the election campaign of the outcome at $2,700 million, about $1 billion down on expectations. Now, I think we were not convinced that all of that would stay in the base until we started to disaggregate some of those numbers, and also the delay of the election into September, the election and then the budget into September has meant that we were able to look at the bankings in July and August to see how those bases were running, and they were running more strongly than we believed. And hence there was more revenue available there than I believe when, for instance, I spoke to the press gallery at the time of the national accounts. But let me make a point about some of the things which your paper said today. You see that you can never really win with the Sydney Morning Herald. It is an extremely good paper, but like any schizoid paper, it has the sort of view from the left of the sort of the middle class sort of trendies who think that if you can't cut the budget deficit or cut discretionary outlays, it really means that you're a heartless, soulless government who keep the company of millionaires and all this sort of stuff. And if you go the other way, you get trapped up by the financial writers who say that you're not running the thing as tightly as you ought to. Now, I don't quite know how they get on down there together, but they seem to keep their act together. Well, now we've got a bit of that schizophrenia today, and what is said in the columns of the Herald today, it's alone in saying this, I might say, is that we have not done enough. Well, let me just make 2 points to you. The starting point for this deficit in May, or in April, was $6 billion. So let's concede them, for the purposes of the discussion, their point about the assets, which I don't concede them, but let's take the 1,000 out. There's a $5 billion reduction, recurrent reduction, from April to September. Not good enough, they say. See, not good enough. And the fact that we are now getting a harvest from discretionary tax changes we made back in 1985, the fact that we haven't taken to slashing outlays and getting into minor and major programs again means that we are not getting the recurrent changes with enough feeling. And because we're not getting them with enough feeling, that we're getting this reduction in calls upon savings from receipts as well as outlays, has diminished the purity of it all. Well, you see, this is this sort of crazy market view, this is where the ideology comes in, that if you do it on outlays and you're maiming one constituency after another, that apparent disregard for one's political self-interest and pursuit of one's objectives is to be applauded comprehensively. But if one broadens the tax base and goes through the tortures of the dam to get the bills into law, and they happen to produce a higher harvest, that's all fortuitous, which is then to be swept to one side. Well, the fact is there is a $5 billion recurrent change since April, and $6 billion, of course, with the assets. And let me just say one thing about the assets again. This argument that we shouldn't count from outlays proceeds. And I gave the example yesterday. For those who were not there, I'll make it again. We're selling the Commonwealth Centre in Chifley Square. The proceeds in this budget will come off the outlays. They say, no, that's not right. That shouldn't be there. If we were to buy the building next door and not put that on the outlays, they'd say it was a fiscal atrocity. How dare you buy something not put on the outlays? So if they want us not to adjust the outlays by the proceeds, we've got to back adjust 50 budgets for all of those on-budget acquisitions that are there. But then they say, but hang on, even if we give you that point, that you are absolutely right about the accounting standards and you're in there with the IMF, the United States Treasury, the British Treasury and everywhere else, what about a call upon Australian savings? Well, it may be that a company that buys these assets buys them out of an operating surplus. If it does, the extent that it funds the acquisition out of operating surplus, it's funding a diminished call on other assets in the economy, on other resources in the economy. In short, it's just bunkum, absolute bunkum. And it's just a point sort of floated across. Another old runner is Reserve Bank profits. And let me just say a couple of things about that. We've had Reserve Bank profits in budgets always. Even in the Stone Age they were there. and they're in the United States Treasury documents. It's the totally correct relationship between a central bank, its earnings and the budget. We pay, unlike the Liberals, market rates of interest on the CGS that the Reserve Bank holds. So we've got a large outlays transaction going to the bank funding that PDI. That lifts its profit, we get it back via the dividend. Totally legitimate. The second place we get it is if the bank sells currency. It's sold American dollars, Japanese yen, pounds, etc., for a higher yield of Australian dollars because of the parity of the current parity of the exchange rates. that produces a profit upon realisation. It's like selling any other Commonwealth asset. We want to sell some of our gold, we want to sell some of our currency, we reap the profit. Now, they said, well, you're relying on that. There's 58 million in there more this year than last year on Reserve Bank profit. I mean, it's bunkum too. But the people who parrot this stuff around were doing all of this sort of accounting in the years gone by, which, you know, well, we don't need to say any more about them, do we?
I've got 5 questions left. We're already right on time. I'll allow just one more, and that's from Paul Kelly.
Paul Kelly, 10 Network. Mr Keating, the budget papers put great stress on micro-reforms, one of which, of course, is privatisation. Do you believe the doubters in the party can be persuaded on privatisation, and how important is this platform change in getting the micro-reforms you need as distinct from just asset sales?
Oh, I think it's important because it's important to be able to intelligently operate a policy. It's important to give a Labor cabinet the capacity to review the assets of the Commonwealth. This view that we acquired something in or developed something in 1945 and that therefore can never be looked at again, that there's some sort of sanctity about it, is of course very conservative and very reactionary. And one of the problems that we've always had in the Labor Party of this government is dealing with the Conservatives and the reactionaries in the Labor Party, in the Labor movement. And the people who stand steadfastly against change. Now, that's important. But one has to say that the major preoccupation of public policy in this country must remain the current account deficit and the accretion of our overseas debt. And that is the principal issue which is being addressed now and will have to be addressed. But these micro reforms are important. They complement the totality of the effort. So each issue has an important place in the matrix. But the big paramount issue is still the current account and will remain that way. Thanks very much.
Mr Treasurer, before you run off to question time, let me thank you for your 7th appearance here and offer you a Press Club tie to add to your collection. At least it's the latest version.
Oh, thank you.
And hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's much better than the last one, that's for sure.
Well, thanks for that. I'll try to get through as many as possible.
Yeah, no, that was good. Thanks.
We did, I think. Did we not?